YouTube, true to form, has just been a useless, absolutely useless platform, incapable of doing its job properly, for whatever reason. We'll just give it a little second just to catch up. I've set all the frames per second and everything. Shouldn't be dropping any frames at all. I saw it spinning away there. The audio shouldn't be low at all. One, two, 1, 2. One, two. Turn the gain up a little bit. My apologies, bear with me a sec. Will I just mess around with these levels a little bit? This is what's so laughable. What's absolutely laughable is the fact that once the levels are set, you should never have to touch them again. You shouldn't have to touch them again. So I just find it hilarious. I find it hilarious that every single time I have to change everything. Anyway, right. Jennifer, thank you. I'll just say now, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I received the PayPal today, so I'm eternally grateful. Thank you very much. You have no idea how helpful that is to me. You can obviously you should be having a blue wrench. Right, Angel Wings, how are you doing? TW, Jennifer, Nathan, Just JP. Really good to see you guys. Let's crack on, shall we? This is Children of the Sun, Chapter 12. Rulers and Commoners, the Doctrine of Theogony. From one end of the region to the other, the children of the sun were looked upon as gods. That is, as beings far removed from the rest of mankind. They had great powers. They could control the weather, they could fly through the air, They could visit the world in the sky and do all manners of things impossible to mortal men. In looking back to the days when the children of the sun ruled in Polynesia and elsewhere, the time is being considered when gods walked the earth, divine beings incarnate as men, the like of which have not been seen since. The importance of this fact in the history of civilization, and especially in the study of mythology and tradition, cannot be exaggerated. For when it is known that the rulers of the archaic civilization were really regarded as gods, tales that speak of olden times when gods lived on earth assume an historical significance. Such tales show that various communities who now have no incarnate gods living with them must in the past have known of such beings, for imagination can be put on one side as a factor in the production of tradition and myth until details otherwise inexplicable are encountered. The supreme importance of this theme makes it imperative to find... Hang on. I forgot to change my picture. The supreme importance of this theme makes it imperative to try to find what was the essential difference between the children of the sun and the rest of mankind. In what did their divinity really consist? If it can be discovered that the actual relationship between the children of the sun and the sun god, then it may be possible to understand in some way how the war gods came into existence. Before starting on this quest, one important point must be noted. It has been stated that the children of the sun were rulers over the communities of the archaic civilization. That does not mean that they were the sole rulers. The analogy of our own country shows that more than one category of rulers can govern a country. At the head of the constitution is the royal family. Then comes a nobility with an extensive variety of rank. Likewise, in the archaic civilization, which, as will be evident in the course of time, was complicated in nature, the ruling group did not consist merely of the children of the sun. Other grades of nobility and of royal rank existed, and in the parts that they played will be discussed in some detail in succeeding chapters. For the present, however, attention will be paid to the children of the sun, so as to define their position as closely as possible. Stop it. Just get up there. Sorry, apologies. My little Nito's being a pain. Just a note to anybody listening to this on a replay, or if this is your first time here, I'm reading this book live. It's the first time I've laid my eyes upon these words, and I've got 3 lovely animals running around to distract me. In the chapter on Egypt, which comes at the end of the discussion of the archaic civilization as a whole, it will be shown of what importance was the coming into being of a ruling group, calling themselves the children of the sun. It is well known that this happened at the beginning of the 5th dynasty. Prior to that, the sun cult was not the state cult of Egypt, and the kings were more closely associated with Osiris, with whom they were identified after death, and Horus, with whom they were identified during life. What distinguished the children of the sun from their predecessors in Egypt and from the rest of the community was their claim to be the actual sons of Re, the sun god. It was said that Re took the place of the king and became the father of his heir. Unfortunately, the children of the sun have died out in most parts of the region, or have not sufficiently been studied, so that it is hard to find instances of the belief in the theogony as an everyday occurrence. Nevertheless, I have found 2 other examples, not including that of the Incas of Peru, who also were children of the sun, in which it is believed that the sun god can become the father of mortals. In both cases, the people claim solar descent. In Aborihu, the Aborihu ruling class of San Cristobal in the Solomons, who call themselves children of the sun, and are so closely connected with the archaic civilization in their use of pyramids, dolmens, portrait statues, and so forth, believe that women can mate with the sun. The Yuki of the Savannah River in the United States call themselves children of the sun. Dark-skinned members of the tribe form a kind of empty aristocracy, and it is believed that they are the actual children of the sun himself and one of their maidens. Pause. I just pause for a second. If you've been listening to me reading the book by Gurdjieff actually talks about the dolmens, and Gurdjieff goes on an expedition to the dolmens in the Transcaucasia region, I think it was. Although only in Egypt, San Cristobal and among the Yuki, have I been able to collect instances of the belief in theogony as a factor in everyday life. It has been preserved through the region in tradition and folklore. In the epic literature of India, the children of the sun usually were born through a process of theogony. A noteworthy example is that of Kunti, or Pritha, a maiden of royal birth, who, by the sun, became the mother of Karna, Vasusena, the brother of Arjuna, the son of Indra. He was born encased in natural armour, and with face brightened by earrings, the first of all wielders of weapons, endowed by the beauty of a celestial child. Again, it is said of him, quote, that far-famed destroyer of hostile hosts, the large-eyed Karna, was born of Pritha in her maidenhood. He was a portion of the hot-beamed sun, born of the sun himself. He was capable of slaying a lion, close quote. Madri, the wife of Pandu, the ancestor of the Pandavas, and famous race of kings that brought the Kurus, in the epic of the Mahabharata, had 2 sons by the Akvins, the twin gods of the Vedas. This form of maiden birth by the action of the sun is a commonplace in the stories of heroes in ancient India. Indonesian folklore tends to connect theogenous origins of ruling families with the archaic civilization. The Bata of Sumatra shows signs of connection with the Dravidian civilizations of India, which itself is so closely connected with the archaic civilization. Their first great king was Singha Mangaraja, the son of a Bata princess, and their great god, Bataru Guru. The royal girl one day ate a fruit of the Anacardium, in which Bataguru had temporarily incarnated himself. Several years later, she bore a son, Singha Mangaraja, who was the ancestor of a line of chiefs ruling over Bakara. On the west shore of Lake Toba, he could make the sun shine or the rain fall at pleasure, and the welfare of the community depended on him. His descendants were not born in like manner. Among the Tontemboam of the Minahasa, the ancestress of the race was the Limimu'ut, who was said to have arrived in a ship and is thus looked upon as human. In one story, she came out of a rock under the action of the sun's rays and gave birth to To'ar, the sun, who became her husband, and presumably was the ancestor of the upper class of the Tontemboan. Or else it is said that the To'ar came out of a hump of foam that gave birth to him under the action of the sun's rays. Thus, in the beginning, a theogony takes place that To'ar is produced by the sun. He then marries Limemu-ut, but it does not seem, so far as I can tell, that the sun has any more children. Folklore and tradition in the Pacific show that the idea of solar theogamy must formerly have been a living thing. Mr. Hokart claims that the earlier kings of Fiji were divine beings. He also says that, according to a folk tale, the daughter of one of these kings was confined, when of a marriable age, in a room so that the sun could not impregnate her with his rays. This points to a belief in the doctrine of theogamy among the early Fijians, just as it exists today in San Cristobal, but not as a vague tradition, but as something that could happen any day. A similar tale is told in Fiji of the Tongan royal family. The daughter of a Tongan chief was called the Mother of the Sun, the Mother of the Sun Child. Her father hid her on account of her great beauty, but without avail. The sun looked upon her, and saw her, and loved her, and in the course of time a child was born to her, whose name she called the Sun Child. Just going to pause for a sec, make sure. Yep, it's coming through nice. Welcome to everybody that's here. If there's, crikey, 10 people here. How you doing? Jennifer, yes. We met on Voice Channel. Christopher Harvey, how you doing? Awakened Alliance, dude, how you doing, man? Good to see you. Sorry, let me continue. In Samoa, the children of the sun disappeared, and the later ruling families were more especially connected. Ruling families were more especially connected with the underworld. The doctrine of theogamy is found in tradition associated with the original family of children of the sun at Manu'a. For it is said that the rays of the sun fell on a woman of Lipata, who bore Aloalolela, sunbeam, who married the daughter of the king of Fiji. Yet the progeny of the Tagaloa family, the original children of the sun, who came from the sky to Samoa, and of a woman, Ui, who came from a place with the sun cult, were not children of the sun. Tagaloa, it will be remembered, changed himself into a war god. One of this family became ancestor of the Pili, whose sons were the first rulers of Upolu. Apologies. The doctrine of theogamy disappeared in Samoa, together with the children of the sun. The birth of Oro, the war god of Tahiti, was as follows. Quote, "The shadow of a breadfruit leaf, shaken by the power of the arm of the Taroa, passed over Hina, and she afterwards became the mother of Oro." End quote. Taroa is similar to Tagaloa of Samoa, and therefore originally was a sun god. Other evidence, already quoted, see pages 138 and 139, suggests that the children of the sun originally ruled over Tahiti. This supports the identification of Taroa as a sun god. Direct evidence of the doctrine of theogamy is not apparent in Hawaii, so far as I know. It is said that formerly Some of the chiefs claimed descent from the great god Cain, evidently a sun god, in which case their birth must have been by a process of theogony. These chiefs went to the sky to visit their relatives, just like sorry. What? Oh, hang on. It's just it's just completely changed my page. Right in the middle of reading it. Hang on. These chiefs went to the sky to visit their relatives, just like the Sa Tagaloa family in Manua. Hawaiian tradition also mentions the days when sky beings came to earth and married their women. These gods, quote, shaped the customs of mankind, end quote, and thus seem to correspond to the children of the sun. But all that is past. All this is past, and all that remains is the knowledge that chiefs used to claim some divine descent. The break between early and late times in Oceania is seen clearly in New Zealand. The doctrine of theogamy is not held by the Maori. The tradition recounts cases of that nature, such as the union between the wife of Tamatea, an historical personage, and the supernatural being, the offspring of which was Uenuku Titi. Although the children of the sun have long since disappeared in Mexico, it is possible from collateral evidence to conclude that they must have come of theogamous regions. In the United States, the Natchez of Louisiana were ruled over by children of the sun, whose ancestors are supposed to have come from the direction of Mexico. Nothing is known of the doctrine of theogamy among them, but the Yuki of the same region, also children of the sun, believed in the fatherhood of the sun. Thus, the Mexicans and Maya had it. Other evidence points the same way. For the great gods of the Aztecs and the other latecomers to Mexico. Hang on, reading live these names. Huitzilopochtli. Huitzilopochtli. Camaxtli. And Mixcotl. I'm just going to spell these words out for you, just so you get a full appreciation of what I'm being expected to do here. Huitzilopotli. This is one word name. Camaxtli and Mixcaoatl. They were said to have gods as fathers and early women as mothers. In the case of the H fathers, I'm just going to call them the H fathers, and Earth. In the case of the H fathers, in the case of the H, the Huitzilopochtli. I don't even know how a Western's supposed to say that word. It is said that one day a devout woman saw in the temple at Tula, floating down from the sky, a ball of feathers which she had put in her bosom. She found herself pregnant after this. Her many children, seeing her in that state, agreed to kill her. But the child, yet unborn, cried out, "Fear not, O my mother, for this danger will I turn to our great honour and glory." He was born with shield and spear, and his left leg and his head, on his left leg and his head, he had green plumes, and his face, arms and thigh were barred with the lines of blue. He fell on the other children and killed them. He was the protector of the Mexicans, and led them on their journey to Mexico. He possessed a shield on which were 5 balls of feathers in the form of a cross, and a golden flag with 4 arrows in the upper part. This shield and flag are said to have been sent down to him from heaven to enable him to perform the glorious deeds of their natural history. Among tribes of North America, with no children of the sun living among them, tales of theogonies are concerned with culture heroes. The Pueblo Indians claim that the children of the sun are children of an earthly woman, or of a foam cap, or of the ancestress of the race embraced by the sun. Some of the Plains Indians have preserved such tales. The Kiowa, for example, say that formerly a girl climbed to the sky in pursuit of a porcupine. To her amazement, the tree got taller as she climbed, so that finally she got to the sky, where she found that the porcupine had turned into the sun. They married and had a son. Her husband warned her against going near a certain plant, of which the top had been bitten off by a buffalo. With the usual feminine curiosity, she found one that had been cropped by a buffalo and pulled it up. It left a hole through which she could see the world that she had forgotten. She took a rope and let herself and her son down by means of it, and her husband, seeing what she did, threw a stone after her and killed her. The child was uninjured and got to the bottom where it was taken care of by the Spider-Woman. One day, in a game, he threw up a wheel, which came down and cut him in two, so that they were twin brothers. After many adventures, in the course of which these twins rid the world of many dangerous monsters, one of them walked into a lake and disappeared forever, while the other transformed himself into a medicine, which is the great palladium of the tribe, and is kept in a small pouch, fringed with scalps, and used on certain ceremonial occasions. The Kiowa have no ruling class of children of the sun, and the tale is told of a being who has been transformed into their national palladium. The Osage branch of the Sioux of the plains have 2 divisions, one connected with peace and the other with war. The warriors claim that they once lived in the sky, and that they were the children of the sun and moon. But among the Omaha, who were formerly connected with them, even this attenuated belief has disappeared, and no connection with the sky world is claimed. The Omaha simply have the thunder being, about whose origin apparently nothing is known. Evidence has been accumulating from more than 1 quarter to identify the culture heroes of various parts of the region. In some parts, they are actually the children of the sun, born of theogonies. In others, while they are not said to have been sons of the sun, their form of birth suggests that they may have originally had that title. For instance, the great hero of the Kiriwina in the Trobriands, east of British New Guinea, were born of a virgin fertilized by a drop of water. In Melanesia, there are tales of culture heroes such as Kat of the Banks Islands and Tagaro of the New Hebrides. The story of the birth of Kat is similar to that of To'ar in Minahasa. He was born of a woman who was a stone that burst asunder, and no mention is made of his father. Tagaro, the great hero of the Whitsuntide Island, is said to have had a child by an earthly woman. It is also believed in Lepers Island that Tagaro can give women children. A similar belief in theogony seems to persist in the Ponape belief that a pregnant woman must not allow the sun to shine on her lest she have a difficult labour. In all these cases, the original setting of the tale has been largely destroyed, and the belief survives only in fragments. The occurrences of the doctrine of theogony serve to throw light on the relationship between the communities of the archaic civilization and those of its successors, particularly in respect of the connection between sun gods and war gods. The, the stories of theogony center around two groups of beings, the children of the sun and war gods. The children of the sun are the actual progeny of the sun god himself, and thus are semi-divine. The war gods, themselves born of like unions, are thus of the same nature, that is to say, semi-divine, and not of the rank of the original sun god himself. Therefore, a son of the sun could become a war god, for this change would neither exalt nor abase him in rank. Who were these war gods? The children of the sun were actual men who once lived in Oceania and elsewhere. Therefore, when it is said that the first war god in Samoa, Teo Tagaloa, was a descendant of the Tagaloa family of the children of the sun, it seems that we must accept the story as historical and grant him a human form. Similarly, it is said that Oro in Tahiti had a son who became a great king. Oro lived at Apoa, which suggests that he was a man. Moreover, no mention is made of theogony in the case of his son. For crying out loud. Huitzilopochtli of the Aztecs, I'm sorry, I can't say that name, is said to have been a great warrior. Similarly, on the hypothesis that the children of the sun of America traditionally were actual men, the twin war gods of the Zuni must have human shape. Therefore, it is reasonable to believe that the war gods throughout the region were actually members of the ruling group of the archaic civilization who founded dynasties for themselves and apparently failed to preserve in their family the belief in the constant intervention of the sun god. In this way, the title of Son of the Sun disappeared. The relationship between the archaic civilization and its successors must, in this scheme, be stable. If this scheme be stable, be founded on some peculiarity of the original ruling group. While possessing children of the sun, who perpetuate themselves in the accompaniment of the belief in constant divine intervention, there must be present some other element that makes it possible for the war gods to emerge and to found families who are born in a normal manner. This problem will be discussed at length in chapters 20 and 23, where it will be seen that the ruling group of the archaic civilization really consisted of two independent groups, of which the children of the sun formed one, while the war gods formed another. The scheme just outlined serves to establish a threefold grading of divine nature. First comes the sun god, supreme over all others, who can intervene on earth and produce children of mortal mothers. These men are semi-divine, incarnate gods, as it were, but not partaking of the nature of their father. Some of these god-born men confound dynasties and become war gods. Their descendants are not so divine as they, for no mention is made of the belief in theogony as a mode of birth among them. Thus, although claiming descent from war gods, who are really only semi-divine, they are a step farther removed from the divinity of the sun god himself. It must not be forgotten that this scheme rests on the basis of the restriction of the belief in theogony as a common occurrence to the children of the sun. If it can be shown that war gods are in the habit of producing children by similar means, then the scheme will have to be abandoned. But this will not affect the main argument of the book. Right, that's the end of chapter 12. The next chapter, chapter 13, Rulers and Commoners, the Sky World. The children of the sun differed in yet another way from the rest of the community. They were closely connected with the sky world, and when they disappeared, direct communication with this world ceased. In Egypt, the sky world is closely connected with the children of the sun, and it is first mentioned in the pyramid texts, in which the king, instead of being identified after death and ruling over the Assyrian land of the dead, went to the sky, there to live in the company of Re. Quote, The kings of the early Pyramid Age in the 13th century before Christ evidently looked confidently forward to indefinite life hereafter maintained in that way, end quote. The pyramid texts, quote, deal almost entirely with a blessed life in a distant realm, end quote. Another quote. Men fall, their name not. Seize thou King Teti by the arm. Take thou King Teti to the sky, then he die, not on earth among men. End quote. This sky world was at first reserved solely for the king. The extension of the privilege to his family and to nobles was accomplished on the basis of the fiction of identity with the king, which was produced by ritual means. It is not necessary at this point to inquire into the origin of this doctrine, but it is evident that once formulated and accepted, it split the community into two groups, that comprising of the king and his family, who built pyramids, and those of his nobles, who actually got to the sky, and the rest of the community, who went to the old land of the dead. Speaking generally, the nobles of Egypt continued to be buried in mastaba tombs, the form of tomb made by the royal family before the invention of the pyramid, and these tombs contain no traces of solar ideas. It must therefore be borne in mind that connection with the sky world does not necessarily in other parts of the region apply to the whole of the ruling class, for, as in Egypt, certain sanctions may be connected with other places of afterlife. In Sumer, the idea of a land of the dead in the sky does not seem to have been prominent. Quote, the idea of a celestial paradise in the faraway skies where only the immortals lived, or mortals who had partaken of the bread of life, does not appear to have had a firm hold in the popular region. End quote. These words of Mr. Langdon show that the belief in Sumeria was confined to certain favoured beings. The old land of the dead in Sumer was the underworld, and only later, when the sun cult began to exert an influence and the children of the sun appear, does the tendency appear to transfer deities such as Tammuz to the sky. The underworld was, throughout Babylonian history, the chief place to which went the dead. Never had they such elaborate doctrines as those expounded in the pyramid texts of Egypt. In ancient India, the ruling families were partly connected with the sky world. In the Rig Veda, both the Devas and the Asuras belonged to the sky, where they lived in Swarga, the heaven of Indra. This is natural, and that the Asuras claimed solar descent. Both they and the Devas were children of Kasyapa, the sun. The Mahabharata mentions Asuras living in the sky. For example, the Palamas and the Kalakanjas live in Hiranyapura, the golden city floating in the air. At the same time, some of the Asura group were closely connected with the underworld. The great city of the Nagas was Patala, which is usually represented as the underworld. Here live not only the Nagas, but also the birds, the Garudas, another branch of the family of the Asuras. Again, Hiranyakasipu was the king of the universe and god of the dead, who lived in Hiranyapura, which, although represented as floating in the air, at the same time is in Patala, that is, the underworld. This underworld is represented as far more beautiful than the heaven of Indra. It is, quote, infinite in extent, filled with hundreds of palaces and elegant mansions with turrets and domes and gateways, abounding with wonderful places for various games and entertainments. End quote. In this underworld, the houses are made of silver and gold, decorated with lapis lazuli, corals and gems, one of which is identical with crystal and with the sun. These houses are high and close to one another. That connection that the Asuras have both with the sky and with the underworld needs careful attention, for it is not only important, but it is apt to cause great difficulty. Why should the ruling groups of the Dravidians or Asuras be connected with the sky and with the underworld? What is the cause of this duality? When dealing with mythology and with traditions, the historical aspects of facts must never be forgotten. In the epics of India, it is clearly understood in the beginning that the contest between the Devas and the Asuras was fought out in the sky, and that these two groups of beings became incarnated in mortal women in order to take part in the great struggle between the Kauravas and the Panchalas. That is the main theme of the Mahabharata. So when these beings became incarnated on earth, they would bring their associations with them. If, therefore, it should happen that any branch of the Asuras, say the Nagas, were connected with the underworld, it would follow that they would be considered as having lived in the underworld, part of the sky world. For the sky world is not necessarily thought of as something quite different from the earth. It can be placed on earth, where the children of the sun have previously lived. It is enough to mention the eyeball of the sun of Hawaiian tradition, who lived in the, quote, shining heavens, end quote, on the borders of Tahiti, to see that the idea of the sky world and tradition need not mean anything more than the former home of the children of the sun. What really is important is the fact of the duality in the ruling groups. The Nagas are practically always represented as living in the underworld, at Patala and elsewhere, not in darkness and gloom, but in a kingdom full of life, wealth and pleasure. It can therefore be taken that the Nagas of India represent that part of the ruling group of the non-Aryan peoples who were connected with the underworld. The Nagas were looked upon in the epic literature as half-brothers of the Garudas, or birds, and they both are represented as living in the sky or in the underworld. They are both sons of the sun, but with different mothers. It was shown that in, quote, the megalithic culture of Indonesia, end quote, that in cases where the people of the archaic civilization had founded ruling classes, the members of which claimed descent from the sky world, the members of those classes went at death to the sky world. The commoners never made such a claim. The spread of Islam over the region has obscured the original beliefs of ruling groups such as the Bugis and the Makassar, but their traditions invariably assert that their male ancestor came from the sky. Similarly, the founders of the civilization of the Kolaka of the southeast Celebes are said to have been men from the sky world. The available evidence suggests that all ruling groups of Indonesia are derived, with the exception of the Mohammedan and other invaders, from the ruling groups of the archaic civilization. In some instances, as has been seen, these rulers called themselves children of the sun, and presumably this title was formerly held in much more widely. This title was formerly held much more widely than at present. But a closer study of the ruling groups of Indonesian peoples, as well as those of Polynesia and elsewhere, has made it clear, as was pointed out some time ago by Mr. Hokart, that the ruling groups themselves are composite. In India, for instance, the Nagas, ancestors of ruling families of the Dravidians, were connected not only with the sky but also with the underworld, and this duality of association forms a bewildering element in the study of Indian literature of the epic period. Similarly, in places such as South Celebes, It is found that the Boogie ruling groups had as ancestors a god from the sky world and a goddess from the underworld. The ruling family thus had its origin, according to the myth, in a union between members of two entirely different groups. For the present, therefore, it is not only advisable but necessary to claim simply that association with the sky world is only found in connection with members of ruling groups, and that commoners, except perhaps in the case of warriors, never have any connection with that place. On the other hand, some members of the ruling group can be connected with the underworld. In Polynesia, the sky world is a thing of the past. It belongs to the days of the children of the sun. In Samoa, the traditions of the colonizing of Manu'a depict the Tagaloa family coming from the skies onto the earth. And the ancestress of Ui, of the ruling family, comes from a place with a sun god who received human sacrifices. But when the children of the sun disappeared, the connection with the sky world was evidently broken off for good, and henceforth the gods and dead lived in the underworld. In other parts of Polynesia, a similar sequence is also to be observed. In Hawaii, the great chiefs of the past were closely connected with the sky. According to Elis, the rulers of Hawaii, who sometimes went to the sky, did not stay there, but were reincarnated in a rejuvenated form on the earth. The commoners go to the gloomy underworld. In Tahiti, with which Hawaii was formerly connected, the classes separate at death. The king of Tahiti was the son of Oro, and was born at Opoa in Raiatea. The rulers and nobility and the members of the great Arioi society, an institution founded by two brothers of Oro, went after death to an earthly paradise on top of a mountain in Raiatea, while the commoners went underground. It is possible that that always happens when I try and say formally. It is possible that formerly the land of the dead for kings in that group was the sky, for the dwelling of the eyeball of the sun, so famous in Hawaiian tradition, was the shining heavens on the borders of Tahiti. The evidence regarding the existence of a belief in New Zealand in a sky world for the dead is somewhat doubtful. Some writers state that the great chiefs and priests of the Maori formerly went to the sky. This is disputed by Elsden Best, an authority whose word is to be trusted. He claimed that the dead always went to the underworld, in the island of Hawaii. I don't know if that's a spelling mistake or if it's Hawaiki. Hawaiki. Anyway. The mythical home of the race of Polynesians. Hawaiki. At the same time, he does not seem to be quite consistent. In 1914, he says, quote, "The broad way of Tain is the path or way by which the spirits of the dead pass on their way back to the fatherland of the race, the place where man originated, whence they pass down to the underworld or ascend to the heavens, according to whether they sympathize most with the Earth Mother or the Sky Father parent." End quote. This would harmonize with the statement that, in some tribes, the great priests called Tuhungas, who are said to have died out, went together with the great chiefs to the sky. It is, I think, best to conclude that the sky world is, for the Maoris, a thing of the past. That the class connected with it has disappeared, leaving only the people connected with the underworld. This agrees with the fact that theogamy and the sun cult only persist in tradition and folklore among these people. A careful comparison of the various Maori tribes in this matter would evidently produce interesting results. For the two groups of authorities may be basing their evidence upon facts derived from different sources. In Melanesia, the underworld is practically universal, especially in these places with no ruling class. The only beings in such places connected with the sky are the culture heroes, who have already been claimed as representatives of the archaic civilization. The ruling class in Mexico believed themselves to go to the sky after death, where commoners went underground. The Yuki of the Savannah River, who call themselves children of the sun, all go after death to the sky, whence came their ancestors. The Natchez of Louisiana were ruled over by sons, whose ancestors came from the sky. I have no evidence with regard to their belief as to the destination of the ghosts after death. But from the principle that ghosts usually go back to the place of the origin of their ancestors, it would be expected that these sons believed themselves, like the children of the sun elsewhere, to go after death to the sky. The Pueblo Indians, who have no ruling class of children of the sun, universally believe that they go after death to the underworld. The analogy of the Yuki just quoted suggests that the Zuni, who call themselves children of the sun, would go to the sky after death. But the Zuni have no belief in theogamy, and they have no people produced by such unions, as among the Yuki. Oh, for God's sake. I wish I knew how to pronounce these words. The beliefs of the Indian tribes of the plains are complicated, as would be expected, for their culture has suffered many modifications as the result of their movement from the eastern area. Among the Sioux, the Dakota have no land of the dead in the sky, but they believe that certain stars are men transported to the sky. Another indication of a former land of the dead in the sky lies in the belief that the ghost of the dead, on the way to the land of the dead, is pushed over a cliff or from a cloud, if it is not tattooed. This suggests a former land of the dead in the sky. The Omaha believe that their ghosts go to the land of the dead by the Milky Way. The Mandan claim that the stars are ghosts, and believe that when a child is born, a star comes to earth and appears in human form, and at death it returns to the sky. The associated Hidatsa, on the other hand, have an underground land of the dead. Such are the beliefs of some of the Indian tribes of North America with regard to the destiny of the ghost after death. Their indefiniteness is an index of separation from their original context. This survey shows that the children of the sun are invariably connected with the sky world and claim to go there after death. In the course of time, the children of the sun have disappeared, and other rulers are usually found in their place. In Polynesia, for instance, these later rulers are connected with the underworld, all with an earthly paradise. This suggests, once again, that the ruling class of the archaic civilization was complex, for the evidence derived from the examination of the doctrine of theogamy leads to the conclusion that later dynasties were derived from these early ruling groups. In India, it will be remembered, the Asuras, who were connected both with the sky and with the underworld, and yet were said to be of solar race, which shows that they were not homogeneous like the children of the sun of Heliopolis, but resemble a ruling class of the classes of the Polynesia, which originally, partly at least, connected with the sky, are now wholly connected with the underworld, or with an earthly paradise. If it be true that the archaic civilization has given rise to communities with war gods connected with the underworld, it follows, as has already been pointed out, that the rulers of the archaic civilization must have formed a complex group. The nature of this group will have to be discussed, and this discussion will take place when the dual organization of society is under review. For the present, it can be stated that the sky world is apparently associated solely with the children of the sun, that commoners never enter it, and that when the children of the sun disappear, communication with the sky world is broken off or is sporadic. The association between the children of the sun and the sky world serves to bring the culture heroes into greater contact with the archaic civilization. The two culture heroes of Indonesia that have played so prominent a part in the previous discussions, the Sayo of the Toraja of Central Celebes, and Lumawig of the Bontok of Luzon in the Philippines, are both connected with the sky. Both came to their respective peoples, married women, had children, and then went back to the sky, leaving their wives and children behind them. Similarly, with the culture heroes of Australia, the two youths who civilized many of the peoples are thought to be still wandering about the earth, but the All-Fathers, who are associated with other tribes, are believed now to live in the sky. For example, Nureli of the Wimbayo made the whole country, rivers, trees, animals. He gave laws to the natives and finally ascended to the sky. In the tribe of Southwest Victoria, the chief being is a gigantic man who lives in the sky. He is of kindly disposition and harms no one, is seldom mentioned but always with respect. All the beings believed in by the tribes conform to the same type. They once dwelt on earth, gave the people their civilization, and then went up to the sky to dwell. Melanesian culture heroes belong to the sky world. Tagaro, the culture hero of Araga, or Whitsuntide Island, came down from heaven, made men and other things, and finally went back to the sky. He was the father of a boy by an earthly woman. Mother and son went up to the sky to see Tagaro and persuaded him to return to earth with them. They climbed down. Tagaro came last and on the way cut the line above the woman and the child, and thus severed connection between earth and sky world. Several Tagaro beings exist in the Melanesian folklore, all of which belong to the sky world, as the Tagaloa of the Samoans and of the rest of Polynesia. They are all Vui, spirits to whom are ascribed the remains of stone structures that exist in various places, so that they evidently belong to the archaic civilization. These culture heroes did not stay. Kat is one of them, who came to Vanua Lava, left in a canoe, and his return is confidently expected. Atabulu is a village of Pentecost, with so many remains of the archaic civilization in the shape of sepulchral stones. In this place are ancient house sites raised perhaps a yard above the ground. Nearby, in Anwalu, are stones over the graves of former chiefs. In the village place of Atabulu lies a stone of winged shape called Vingaga. This Vingaga, quote, the flyer with webbed wings, end quote, who came from the sky to the village, was a supernatural being with a Vui, who, after a time, returned to the sky world. American culture heroes are connected with the sky world. Their mother comes thence, or else their father is said explicitly to have been the sun himself. And in the case of the Pueblo Indians, these heroes stand in strong contrast with the rest of the community. The Zuni Indians, for instance, claim to be connected solely with the underworld. There they were made, and there they go after death. At the same time, Zuni culture came from the twins born of the foam cap by the extension of the rays of the great Sun Father. To them were given knowledge and the leadership and dominion of all men. In the beginning, the twins and the priest fathers gathered in council for the naming and selection of man groups and creature kinds, and thus organized the social organization of the whole tribe. The Sia Indians of the Pueblo region say that the twin children of the sun organized on earth the cult societies of the people. Among the Hopi Indians, the story is told of twin children who brought them out of the underworld and civilized them. In the eastern states is found the claim to have been civilized by beings associated with the sky world. The founders of the Natchez ruling house came both from the direction of Mexico and from the sky. The Yuki claimed that their culture hero was either a supernatural being or else a child of the sun. The story runs that formerly, when nothing existed but an expanse of water and air, certain sky beings with animal names made the earth by fishing it up from the waters. A woman of the sky world became with child, and when the boy was born, she took him to the rainbow, the gathering place of the sky beings, to be initiated. After a time, the mother and child were driven away and seemed to have fallen to the earth. The sun was called the sun, and he became the ancestor of the Yuki. He taught them all their ceremonial and gave them the knowledge of certain remedies. The Creeks attribute their civilization to a being called, quote, the Master of Breath, end quote, who is associated with the sky world. The creation tale of the Huron, already quoted, shows how the culture hero came from the sky. It is not necessary to give more examples of the sky origin of American heroes. That has already been done by Brinton and summarized in the quotation already made from his work. The survey just completed shows that the sky world often is a thing of the past. Either the children of the sun have once ruled and disappeared, or else these culture heroes have come from the sky and returned there, breaking off connection with the earth. Only when the children of the sun or their direct descendants still rule does direct communication with the sky world still exist. In all places, the passing of the beings connected with the sky world means the severance of direct intercourse with that land. When, therefore, mention is made of sky gods among a people who have no class of the community connected with the sky, it will have to be borne in mind that these sky gods may be, and probably are, survivors from the time when sky-born beings lived on the earth. When mention is made, for example, among the Maori or the Tangaloa, who is in the sky, the explanation cannot be that he is a deity who is the product of native speculation. On the contrary, Tangaloans actually walked the earth at Manu'a, the homeland of the Eastern Polynesians. What has happened is that the children of Tangaloa have gone, but that Tangaloa has survived in tradition. The relation between the children of the sun and the sky world makes it possible to link still closer the rulers of the archaic civilization and the culture heroes among various peoples. They belong to a world with which no one else has any connection. The rest of the community belong to the underworld or to some land of the dead over the sea. It is possible to approach the problem of the sky world from another standpoint. It can be shown that the children of the sun acted as high priests of the sun cult wherever they went. This is not only an example of general theorem. This is not only a special example of a general theorem that cults of gods are only carried on by their descendants. I've already established this thesis in the megalithic culture of Indonesia for the communities therein studied, but it is necessary to return once again to this matter. In Egypt, from the time of the 5th dynasty onwards, the king was the high priest of the sun cult and had to perform daily ceremonies in connection with the sun god. The cult which he had to render towards the god was that which a dutiful son renders to his father. The king, in relation to the gods, and the eldest son in relation to his father, were on exactly the same plane. The king was himself a god, and the god whose cult he carried on was his father. Therefore, the cult of the gods of Egypt was an ancestor cult in the royal family. In the tomb, the ancestors of each man received the funerary rites of their sons. In the temples, the gods received the divine cult at the hands of their sons, the kings. In the cult of the god, the son, that is, the king, was assisted by his wife, usually his sister, and his mother, the wife of a dead king. The temple itself was planned in the same manner as a palace. Round it was a sacred wood, and a lake was in the grounds, just as are seen in the pictures of private houses of the upper classes. Nothing distinguished the dwelling of the god from that of his descendants. The gods of Egypt lived in their temples in the manner of mortals. They had luxurious rooms fitted for the use of the occupant. The first appropriations of lands in Egypt were apparently those destined for the upkeep of the temples and their staffs. The military chiefs only appeared later, about the time of the 12th dynasty, or perhaps even later. The cause of the expeditions to Asia and the regions of the Upper Nile was simply the need of materials for the building and decorating of temples, and for the use in the temple ritual. In fact, it is not saying too much, according to Moret, to claim that the upkeep of the table of the gods, the filling of the sacred vases, and the procuring of the necessary clothing and ointments for the state cult was one of the chief preoccupations of the king and the royal administration. The king had to provide all the supplies for the temples and for the tombs whose occupants had been granted the favour of royal funerary ceremonies. It is thus obvious that the greater part of the organisation of ancient Egypt was focused on the temples and royal palaces. The king stood at the centre of a vast complex organisation, concerned mainly with the cult of the royal dead, and with the whole economic and social life of the community revolved around its centre. This makes it possible to understand the significance to the Egyptians of their king. In the words of Moret, quote, "The Egyptians worshipped in Pharaoh not the strongest, best-born, richest man, but the son of the gods and their priest, who acted as intermediary between men and gods. On this priest descended the cult of gods and of the dead. This cult having preserved the religious rites of its ancestors, it was necessary that the king, in order to be able to celebrate them, should be of the same race as the gods and the Assyrian dead. Whence the theory of the divine birth of the pharaoh. The king had, moreover, each day to receive a new supply of the fluid of life. One consequence of this interdependence of state cult and ruling family was that when one dynasty or one branch of the ruling family overthrew another, the result was a new state god. For example, when, as seems to have been the case, the Heliopolitan ruling family got power, the solar cult became the state region of Egypt, this cult being that of the god from whom the king of Heliopolis was descended. Similarly, when the ruling houses of Memphis or Thebes got the throne, the state gods were changed. So when, in consequence of invasions of victorious strangers, the king of Egypt was no longer the son of the gods, their cults, left in the hands of ordinary mortals, were neglected. According to the papyrus Saliari, says Moret, the Hyksos king, Apopai, abandoned the cult of Re for that of Sutek, of which cult the Theban Sikenenre, Sikenenre, as descendant of the indigenous royal family, took charge. It is not surprising that, so intimate being the ties between the ruling family and the state cult, the commoners seemingly played no part in the formation of the Egyptian religious system, certainly not of the solar cult. The necessity for the maintenance of this vast system made it imperative to found large priestly corporations, usually hereditary, and in the higher orders of noble or royal birth. This priestly class has produced the great developments of religious thought in Egypt, the commoners apparently taking no part in this matter. As is said, quote, no one was of necessity excluded from the mysteries of the Egyptian religion. These were as accessible to the people as to the nobility. However, true it may be that the former troubled themselves but little on the subject, and left it to the priests to take thought for the offerings. The people would naturally have more faith in the power of amulets and magic than had the cultured classes, yet fundamentally the religious belief of all classes was the same." End quote. Since the cult of the state deities was primarily an ancestor cult of the royal family, it is not surprising to meet with this indifference on the part of the ordinary people. Little is known of the manner in which the religious system of the Sumerians was carried out. At the time of the first dynasty of Babylon, the priests seem to have contained members of the royal family. The Sumerian kings were evidently identified with Tammuz, the god of vegetation, the son of the great mother goddess, and represented him in certain ceremonies. As in Egypt, the ordinary people seem to have taken no part in the production of religious system. In the words of Robertson Smith, quote, "The official system of Babylon, an Assyrian religion, as it is known to us from priestly text and public inscriptions, bears clear marks of being something more than popular traditional faith. It has been artificially moulded by priestcraft and statecraft in much the same way as the official religion of Egypt. That is to say, it is in great measure an artificial combination, for imperial purposes, of elements drawn from a number of local worships. In all probability, the actual religion of the masses was always much simpler than the official system." End quote. Indian religion seems to have been primarily an affair of the ruling groups. The compositions of the Aryan immigrants into India were long regarded as typical of the first strivings of the human mind towards the comprehension of the mysteries of the universe. They were supposed to represent the infancy of human speculation. But of late years, the advance of knowledge of the conditions under which the civilization of the Aryans of India was developed, and the more critical study of the writings themselves, has convinced most students that these writings, far from being spontaneous products of naive speculation, are, on the contrary, highly artificial, and the product not of the beginnings of religious thought, but rather of its later and modified forms. This point of view has forcibly been expressed by Barth. Quote, "My views on the Veda are not precisely the same as those which are most generally accepted. For in it I recognize a literature that is preeminently sacerdotal. I don't know that word. Sacerdotal. Sacerdotal, and in no sense a popular one. And from this conclusion I do not, as is ordinarily done, except even in the hymns, the most ancient of the documents. Neither in the language nor in the thought of the Rig Veda have I been able to discover that quality of primitive natural simplicity which so many are fain to see in it. The poetry it contains appeared to me, on the contrary, to be of singularly refined character and artificially elaborated, full of illusions and reticences, of pretensions and mysticism and theosophic insight, and the manner of its expression is such as reminds one more frequently of the phraseology in use among certain small groups of initiates than the poetic language of a large community. And these features I am constrained to remark as characteristic of the whole collection. Not that they assert themselves with equal emphasis in all the hymns, the most abstruse imaginings being not without their moments of simplicity of conception, but there are very few of these hymns which do not show some trace of them, and it is always difficult to find in the book and to extract clearly defined portions of perfectly natural and simple conception. The hymns, as I have already remarked, do not appear to show me the least trace of popular derivation. I rather imagine that they emanate from a narrow circle of priests, and that they reflect a somewhat singular view of things. I am therefore far from believing that the Veda has taught us everything on the ancient social and religious condition of even Aryan India, or that everything there can be accounted for by reference to it. Outside of it, I see room not only for superstitious beliefs, but for popular religions, more or less distinct from that which we find in it. We shall perhaps find that the past did not differ so much from the present as might first appear, and that India has always had, alongside of its Veda, something equivalent to a great Kavate in Vishnuit religions, which we see in the Ascendant at a later date, and that these existed contemporaneously, for it was a very much longer period than has till now been generally supposed. End quote. Later on, when the ascendancy of the Brahmins was complete, the relationship between the priesthood and the cult of the gods became even more intimate. The Brahmins claimed to be divine, and a worshipper had to have all his religious rites performed for him by a Brahmin priest. The Brahmins were responsible in India for the institution of caste, with its multitudinous restrictions of all kinds. The official culture of Brahmanism, says Barth, was aristocratic and is competent only for chiefs and of men of wealth. Even the domestic ritual which it involved was costly and far beyond the means of a poor man. The Brahmins formed, quote, the intellectual and religious aristocracy of the nation, end quote, and they were at the head of all new religious movements in Hinduism and subsequent ages. With regard to the Dravidians, it is not possible to estimate accurately the part played by the ruling classes in the religious systems. It would seem, however, that cult gods were associated with hereditary priesthoods of royal birth. For example, it is probable that certain cults were introduced to the Aryans by the priestly family of Brigu, which seems to have been an Asura, that is, a Dravidian. It is known further that the Brahmins derived the fundamental doctrines of the Upanishads from Kshatriyas, that is, the children of the sun. The priests of the Nagas, another people of the Dravidian or non-Aryan civilization, probably belonged to the Kshatriya or royal class of children of the sun. This is so nowadays among the peoples of the Chenab Valley in the Himalayas. Oldham says, quote, in this we have a survival of ancient customs existing in the far-off days, where the Kshatriya chief offered his own sacrifices. End quote. These temples are in honor of the old deified chiefs of the Nagas, and the cults carried on in them constitute another example of the temple ritual being simply an ancestor cult of the ruling family. It is beyond doubt that the main developments of religion in India were in the hands of the two upper castes, the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, or rulers. Not only did the Brahmins produce Brahmanism and the multiplication of the Hindu sects, but to the Kshatriyas, India owes many dogmas, especially that of reincarnation. Buddhism and Jainism are intimately connected with the ruling families of the serpent-worshipping Naga races of the Dravidian times. The gradual development of a sacred language, only understood by a few priests, still further shows that the religious thought of India was in the hands of people who claimed special relationships with the gods. It may be claimed that this great priestly development of Indian religion was accompanied by another development of popular religion, and many customs are pointed to in support of this contention. This argument certainly may have some weight, but it is not stably founded. For, as has been seen, the present-day Indian peoples have a long history behind them, and many of them clearly are derived from highly civilized peoples of the past. If it is proposed to select communities possessing the popular religions that stand out of the great priestly development, where shall they be found? Apparently, nowhere in India, outside of the food gatherers like the Vedas and other jungle tribes of South India, a Dravidian tribe, such as the Oraon of Chota, Nagpur, possess a religion system compounded of elements brought with them from their original home, and the others that they have derived from the Kols. Their religion is purely utilitarian. Quote, they look upon God as being too good to punish them, and therefore they do not think that they are answerable to him in any way for their conduct. All their anxiety is about this world, and all their religious practices tend only to worldly things, namely, to get good crops and be free from sickness. End quote. The Kols, again, are connected with the ancient ruling races of India. In this case, as in others, inquiry invariably leads to the communities of the archaic civilization. Ignoring these considerations for a moment, and conceding the feasibility of separating peoples into categories according to the nature of the deities whom they are said to worship, can any signs be detected of an independent development among the people of lower culture in India of a cult of gods? In the census report for 1901, Sir Herbert Risley discusses the less advanced peoples of India, whom he calls animistic. He says, quote, we may sum up the leading feature of animism in India. It conceives of a man passing through life surrounded by a ghostly company of powers, elements, tendencies, mostly impersonal in their character, shapeless phantasms, of which no image can be made and no definite data can be formed. No definite idea can be formed. End quote. He then goes on to compare this animism with the popular Hinduism of the present day, and the form of religion which came into being after the revival of Brahmanism and the downfall of Buddhism in India. It is a medley of all kinds of religious systems, Vedic, Dravidian, Brahmanic, Christian, Mohammedan, and so on, but the main thread of development is, as has been seen, held by the Brahmins, who have been responsible for the production of new sects. Risley defined Hinduism as animism more or less transformed by philosophy, or as magic tempered by metaphysics. Quote, the fact is, he says, that within the enormous range of beliefs and practices which are included in the term Hinduism, there are comprised two entirely different sets of ideas, or, one may say, two widely different conceptions of the world and life. At one end, at the lower end of the series, is animism, an essentially materialistic theory of things which seeks by means of magic to ward off or to forestall physical disasters, which looks no farther than the world of sense, and seeks to make that as tolerable as the conditions seeks to make that as tolerable as the conditions will permit. At the other end, pantheism, combined with a system of transcendental metaphysics. End quote. He then goes on to say that, quote, the animistic usages of which we find such abundant traces in Hinduism appear indeed to have passed into the religion from two different sources. Some are derived from the Vedic Aryans themselves, others from the Dravidian races who have been absorbed into Hinduism. As to the first, Bergain has shown in his treatise on Vedic religion that the Vedic sacrifice, which is still performed by the more orthodox Hindus in various parts of India, is nothing more nor less than an imitation of certain celestial phenomena. It is, in other words, merely sympathetic magic directed in the first instance to securing the material benefits of sunshine and rain in their appointed seasons. The Vedas themselves, therefore, are one source of the manifold animistic practices which may now be traced through popular Hinduism. They have contributed not only to the imitative type of sacrifice, but also the belief, no less magical in its character, that by the force of penance and ascetic abnegation, man may shake the distant seat of the gods and compel them to submit themselves to his will. It would be fruitless to attempt to distinguish the two systems of magic usage, the Vedic and the animistic. They are of mixed percentage, like the people who observe them, partly Indo-European and partly Dravidian. End quote. In other words, it is possible the whole of the animism of the peoples of India represents what the native mind has selected from more highly developed religious systems, and that it has nothing primitive about it. The quotation at least compels an open mind on the subject, because the archaic civilization stands between that of the present peoples of India. It is imperative to seek in it first of all the source of the present-day animism. No valid reason exists to deny this conclusion, and much to accept it. In Indonesia, the available evidence goes to show that the cults of gods are carried on by those who claim descent from them. That is, by the immigrants who came in with the archaic civilization and imposed themselves as rulers. They claimed to be connected with the sky world and carried on cults connected with their divine ancestors. The ordinary people take no active part in these cults and obviously could have had nothing to do with their development. Not only are they excluded from the state cult, but they do not seem to take any interest in it at all. For, as has been pointed out, the indigenous population cares but little for the gods in the sky, the ancestors of the sky-born rulers. This evidence is so important that I may perhaps be allowed to quote it in full. Here Crete says, quote, "Where the belief in and the worship of gods is an integral part of the life of primitive man, he has no more than a suspicion of his gods, and that suspicion has but little influence upon his daily life." End quote. Again, he says that Torajaman is, quote, quite conscious of the relationship between man and the ghosts of his ancestors, but when anyone asks him about his gods and spirits, then perhaps he might have something to tell which he has learned by chance. But generally he refers the questioner to the priests. End quote. In Nias, where the religion is well developed, quote, "The Nias people do not worship their gods, they only expect good from them." End quote. Herr Westenberg says of the Karobata of Sumatra that, quote, "The tales about the gods are preserved by the priests, for the ordinary people know practically nothing about them. They only know what they have picked up here and there." End quote. It is fortunate that these field workers have noticed this indifference of commoners towards the gods of the community. I am confident that this proposition is of universal application, and the inquiry will bear out the statements of these students. It is possible to support this conclusion from another direction. Quote, "Among all the peoples of Borneo, a number of myths are handed on from generation to generation by word of mouth. These are related again and again by those who make themselves reputations as storytellers, especially the old men and women, and the people are never tired of hearing them repeated, as they sit in groups about their hearths, between supper and bedtime, and especially when camping in the jungle. The myths vary considerably in the mouths of the different storytellers, especially of those that live in wide separated districts, for the myths commonly have a certain amount of local colouring. Few or none of the myths are common to all the people, but those of any one people are generally known in more or less authentic form to their neighbours. Although many of the myths deal with such subjects as the creation of the world, of man, of animals and plants, the discovery of fire and agriculture, subjects of which the mythology has been incorporated in the religious teachings of the classical and Christian worlds. The mythology of these people has little relation to their religion. The god figure but little in their myths, and the myths are related with little or no religious feeling, no sense of awe, and very little sense of obligation to hand them on unchanged. They are related in much the same spirit and on the same occasions as the animal stories, of which the people are also fond, and they may be said to be sustained by the purely aesthetic or literary motive rather than the religious or scientific motives." End quote. This quotation shows where lie the real interests of the Borneo peoples. They are concerned with homely matters, and not with the vague figures of the gods, the ancestors of their ruling classes. Knowledge of the gods belongs to the priests, whose business it is to preserve it. The ordinary man is more interested in his own affairs and in the gods of his own folk. The fact that the tales are allowed to be varied shows the absence of any religious feeling. For the usual rule in the case of sacred myths is that the slightest deviation from the exact wording will be visited with the direst penalties. The corollary to the theorem that the cults of the sky gods are in the hands of those who claim relationship with them is that where no such class exists, such cults will be absent. It is possible to put this matter to the test. Certain peoples have been visited by culture heroes, beings who came from the sky, married some of their women, and then departed without founding a ruling class. Some people, including the Toraja of the Central Celebes, the Bontoc of Luzon, the Australians, and certain peoples of New Guinea, Melanesia, and North America. The Poso do Tojo group of the Toraja of Central Celebes, who have no chiefly class, say that a culture hero, Laseo, the Sun Lord, once visited them and civilized them, and that his sons went away elsewhere to find chiefly houses. These peoples have no hereditary priesthood, and men, except in rare circumstances, do not act as priests. That is reserved for women. Priestesses are not concerned with cults of gods. Their functions are practical, for they are needed in ceremonies connected with illness, agriculture, funerals, and house building. It may be thought that these functions of priestesses are of native origin, but the Toraja deny this and claim the sky people began the craft by instructing some women whom they took to the sky for the purpose. In the megalithic culture of Indonesia, it has been shown that these functions of the initiated priesthood persist because the culture heroes and other people of the archaic civilization who introduced the use of stone, irrigation, and so on also brought with them the ideas with regard to the nature of the life of man, which made it imperative for the priesthood to continue if men were to remain in health and to get their food supply, to build houses satisfactorily, and to find their way to the land of the dead. The Toraja have a few deities, although, as Crete says, there is no real interest in them. If these deities are derived from the archaic civilization and are not the product of native thought, their survival must be explained. And it can be shown that they bear a direct relationship to each Toraja man and woman, as well as to the people of the archaic civilization. In the first instance, the Toraja have two chief deities, Ilai and Indara. Ilai above and Indara below. Quote, "These are known as Otios deities, who reign above and beneath as rulers, and do not trouble themselves with men." End quote. These two deities made the first Toraja man out of stone images and then retired into the background, being but rarely called upon. Another god, Pudisongi, quote, "the Lord in the room," end quote, figures in the Toraja mythology, presumably because he plays an important part when the priestesses are engaged in the cure of illness. The theory of illness is that the life of the patient has been taken from them by some agency, such as a sky being. When she wishes to cure anyone, the priestess goes into a trance, and her life, accompanied by her familiar sky spirit, goes to the sky, to Puidisongi, to claim the life of the patient. Puidisongi decides whether it should be restored or not. Thus, the persistence of a god is accompanied by some useful function on his part. Croit goes on to say, quote, "We shall find the names of other gods in various prayers that are included in this volume. It is superfluous to mention here that the ordinary people know no more of them than the name. In general, the knowledge of these gods and of many spirits is the property of the priestesses. The people know them not. The people know only of one god, and that is Pui Mpalaburu. His name means the kneader, and this refers to his function of man-maker. Although creation was performed by other gods, it was Pu Mpalaburu who ordered it to be done. In prayers, he is named as the god who separated the fingers of the hand, the lips, and so on. In his function of man-maker, he is supposed to have lived in a house, the floor lathes of which consist of human fingers, and the roof beams of ribs, and so on, and he uses them to make men. His betel pouch consists of a human scalp. This important god performs a function of vital interest to every Naraja, the making of human beings. The Toraja have none of the usual type of deities that are to be found in Egypt and elsewhere, no war gods or sun gods, or any of the personifications of nature. The two gods who really do play a part in their theology are intimately associated with them in connection with the cure of illness and with the process of birth. The Toraja tell of the time where close intercourse existed between the sky and the earth. In those days, the sky lay near to the earth, and the separation took place on account of the nausea caused in the gods by the Toraja pigs. Now that intercourse is broken off, except for the priestesses, the Toraja know practically nothing of the sky world. This tradition of separation agrees with that of the Laseo, in that it can be interpreted as meaning that the sky-descended people once lived among the Toraja. Now that they have gone, the priestesses alone can communicate with the sky. The Toraja, in their religion, pay no attention to deities that perform no useful function. Ilai and Indara having created men, have retired, so to speak, and are not the objects of any cult. Pu Mpalaburu, the actual maker of each human being, is of importance and is the object of a cult. In this way, he and similar gods constitute an exception to the rule that the cults of gods are really ancestor cults. Precisely the same attitude is taken by the Australians with regard to their culture heroes. They have retained no sky gods at all, and simply remember their culture heroes as beings superior to them in magic and knowledge, from whom they derived their civilization. It is said that the Australian All-Fathers were deities in the making, but no reason exists to believe this to be so. For their culture heroes, whether the two youths or the All-Father, seem to be traditional. The youths certainly are not the object of any form of cult. As for the All-Father, it is not necessary to quote the words of Howitt. It is only necessary to quote the words of Howitt. Quote, "In this being, although supernatural, there is no trace of a divine nature. All that can be said of him is that he is imagined as the ideal of those qualities which are, according to their standard, virtues worthy of being imitated. Such would be a man who is skillful in the use of weapons of offence and defence, all-powerful in magic, but generous and liberal to his people, who does no injury or violence to anyone, yet treats with severity any breaches of custom or morality." End quote. how it fails to see any form of religious feeling associated with this being. He discusses the matter and says in conclusion, quote, "But all this does not bring us to the worship of the ancestor, who is supposed to have developed into the All-Father." He goes on to say, "Although it cannot be alleged that the Aborigines have consciously any form of religion, it may be said that their beliefs are such that under favourable conditions it might have developed into an actual religion based on the worship of Mangan Ngua, or Baim." Oh, I'd love to see how anybody else would pronounce these. The culture heroes of Melanesia are the same case as those of Australia. Although sky beings, they do not receive any active cult. Throughout Melanesia, ancestor cults are prominent, and little of a cult of deities can be observed. This goes with the absence throughout the greater part of the region of a ruling class. As among the Toraja and in Australia, certain beings who are remembered as creators receive no cult. In San Cristobal, there are beings called Figona or Hilona. Quote, "The name Figona is also known at Florida and is applied to beings whose power exercises itself in storms, rains, drought, calms, and in the growth of food. But these the natives decline to admit to be simple spirits, thinking they must once have been men, and doubtless some so-called were men not long ago. One being only is asserted there to be superhuman, never alive, with a mere human life, and therefore not now a ghost, one that now receives no worship, but is the subject of stories only, without any religious consideration. This is Kosvasi, a female. How she came into existence no one knows. She made things of all kinds. She became herself the mother of a woman from whom the people of the island descended. She was the author of death by resuming her cast-off skin. She was the originator of the varying dialects of the islands around. For having started on a voyage, she was seized with ague, which shook so much that her utterance was confused. These spirits, end quote, these spirits, such as they are, have no position in the religion of the Solomon Islands. The ghosts, the disembodied spirits of the dead, are objects of worship. The Tindalo of Florida, Tidado of Isabel, Tindaolo of Guadalcanal, the Leoa of Sa'a, Atoro of San Cristobal. So in the Solomons and in Indonesia, supernatural beings, whatever their powers, do not receive cults unless they have relatives on earth, or else are useful to the community. Even then, they do not get much attention. In the Banks Islands, a form of cult is attached to certain spirits, called Vui, to whom belong culture heroes such as Kat and Tagaro. This cult is not attached directly to the spirit, but to certain objects, usually stones, identified with the spirit. Quote, such stones have some of them been scared to some spirit of ancient... Such stones have some of them been sacred to some spirit from ancient times, and the knowledge of the way to approach the spirit who is connected with them has been handed down to the man who now possesses it. Some of these objects of sacrificial worship are well known, and can only be approached by the person to whom the right of access has been given and handed down to them. There must be between the worshipper who desires advantage and the medium spirit who bestows it, not only the medium of the stone, but whatever material object the spirit is connected with, but also the man who, through the stone, has got a personal acquaintance with the spirit. In the northern New Hebrides, spirits are approached very commonly at the stones, and offerings are made to them upon the stones to secure their favour or to reconcile them if offended. Such sacrifices are made for sunshine, rain, and abundant crops. So sacrifices to spirits are for material benefits, and not by way of worship to the particular spirit. It is important, too, that the cult is associated with the stones, and with beings that have already shown strong signs of association with the archaic civilization, with its divine rulers possessed of magical power beyond other men. It would therefore appear from the statements of Codrington that the religious systems of the Melanesians are centered around ghosts of ancestors. Spirits, whatever their powers, are neglected unless some link connects them with the earth in the form of stones that are supposed to be their seat. The Polynesians stand in the strongest contrast to the Melanesians. Ellis, in his Polynesian researches, gives an account of the priesthood of the Polynesians of Tahiti. Quote, "The priests of the national temples were a distant class. The office of the priesthood was hereditary in all its departments. In the family, according to the patriarchal usage, the father was the priest. In the village or the district, the family of the priest was sacred, and his office was held by one who was also a chief. The king was sometimes the priest of the nation, and the highest sacerdotal divinity was often possessed by some member of the reigning family. This intimate connection between their false religion and political despotism is, however, most distinctly shown in the fact that the kings personifying the god, and receiving the offerings brought to the temple, and the prayers of the supplicants, which have been frequently presented to Tamatoa, the present king of Raiatea. The only motives by which they were influenced in their religious homage or service were, with very few examples, superstitious fear, revenge towards their enemies, and a desire to avert the dreadful consequences of the anger of the gods, and to secure their sanction and aid in the commission of the grossest crimes." End quote. The Polynesians lived in the midst of religious ceremonies. Ellis mentions a number of such ceremonies. Quote, "An ubu, or prayer, was offered before they ate their food, and when they tilled their ground, planted their gardens, built their houses, launched their canoes, cast their nets, or commenced or concluded a journey. The first fish, taken periodically on their shores, together with a number of kinds regarded as sacred, were conveyed to the altar. The first fruits of their orchards and the gardens were also taumaha, or offered, with the portion of their livestock, which consisted of pigs, dogs, and fowls. And it was supposed death would be inflicted on the owner of the occupant of the island, from whom the gods should not receive such acknowledgement." End quote. Other ceremonies were connected with the purification of the land after the incursion of an enemy, the building of temples, the illness of their rulers, various other events, thus forming a strong contrast with the customs of peoples with no ruling class descended from the beings of the sky. Apparently, the real old hereditary priesthood of the Polynesians was formed in their ancestral home, and the necessary knowledge was handed on from generation to generation. Quote, "They were the astrologers, magicians, poets, historians, often warriors, and not least important, the navigators. Where the great knowledge of the stars they possessed enabled them to guide their vessels from end to end of the Pacific, and even to the Antarctic regions." End quote. These old priests were credited with all manner of extraordinary powers, including such feats of illusion as the, quote, "mango trick," end quote. Now that, as for example, in New Zealand, these old priests have died out, much of this knowledge has gone with them. So it is not surprising to find that the culture of the Polynesian shows signs of decadence. Elsewhere in Polynesia, as is natural, considering the uniform nature of their culture, the office of priests is hereditary. In Samoa, the father of the family carries on the ancestor cult. With regard to the gods of the villages, it is said that, quote, the priests in some cases were the chiefs of the place, but in general someone in a particular family claimed the privilege and proposed to declare the will of the god. His office was hereditary. He fixed the days for the annual feasts in honor of the deity, received the offerings, and thanked the people for them. He decided also whether or no the people might go to war. End quote. It is significant that in Samoa, the chief classes of priests are the prophets or sorcerers, family priests, priests of the war gods, and keeper of the war gods, and that the priests of the war gods evidently constituted the most important group. No sun cult is now reported on the island. So, with the disappearance of the children of the sun, has gone that of any priests who may have had charge of the sun cult. The evidence from Melanesia, when compared with that from Polynesia, shows that while the form of cult attached to the personal gods of the Polynesians is not exactly the same as that associated with the Vui spirits of Melanesia, the two are probably connected. Cults of gods in Polynesia, such as Oro in Tahiti, Rongo in Mangaya, and the various war gods elsewhere, are carried on by men who claim to be their descendants. When these ruling families die out, with them go the actual cults of these gods. But some indirect cults are connected with the Vui of spirits of Melanesia, who, for various reasons, have been equated to the children of the sun of the archaic civilization. They have left no descendants, but are remembered as culture heroes. Therefore, no direct cult of them is maintained. At the same time, they are connected with certain stones, where are carried on ceremonies directed towards utilitarian ends. Since the archaic civilization is directly concerned with stones, it is reasonable to claim that this fact has caused the people of Melanesia to attach importance to certain stones. The cult carried on in this way is purely for utilitarian ends. It does not constitute a cult of the spirits themselves. They are remembered as the Vui, and not as the ancestors of various groups. The cults of the initiated priesthoods of Indonesia belong to this category. The archaic civilization is credited with their institution, and they are concerned with utilitarian ends, leechcraft, agriculture, and so on. And although connection with the sky has been interrupted, the priestesses can get there when necessary. It must therefore be borne in mind that although the actual cults of the gods of the sky world are carried on by their descendants, yet ceremonies connected with these beings can be performed in other ways, but in every case the means of intercourse must be some material object or some social institution directly associated with the people of the sky world, that is, with the archaic civilization. The inference is that while the natives are not concerned with the family cults of the rulers of the archaic civilization, yet they have learned from them the necessity, imaginary of course, of performing certain ceremonies for the maintenance of health, food supply and so on, and have taken good care to preserve the means of performing these ceremonies. In North America, the evidence points to exactly the same conclusion. Cults of gods were in the hands of ruling classes. In the Maya settlement of Mayapan, the rulers were priest kings, claiming descent from the divine founders of the city. Probably Mexico formerly had priest kings, and the kings in later times acted on certain occasions as high priests of the state cult. But in the days of the Aztecs, this office has become hereditary in the families of very high birth. The head priests were called Quetzalcoatl, and probably the most revered priest in Mexico was the priest of Quetzalcoatl, the great culture hero of the Mexicans, who dwelt in Cholula, and was regarded as the direct descendant of Quetzalcoatl. He lived a life of great austerity. In the origin myth of the Quiche of Guatemala, It is said that their ancestors were led by priests, and the early royal family acted as priests. In reviewing the religious systems of the rest of North America, it becomes evident that the forms of their various cults are determined by the processes similar to those which acted in the case of the regions already discussed. In Mexico and among the Maya, the highest ranks of the priesthood were recruited from the royal family, and the peoples had a great and elaborate pantheon consisting of diverse deities. But in regions such as those of the Pueblo Indians, the religious system is utilitarian. The Zuni are looked upon as the most religious people among the Pueblo Indians on account of the number of their ceremonies. Their religion is thus summed up by Mrs. Stevenson. Quote, "They look to their gods for nourishment and for all things pertaining to their welfare in this world, and while the woof of their religion is coloured with poetic conceptions, when the fabric is separated by thread, we see that the web is composed of a few simple practical concepts. Their highest conception of happiness is physical nourishment and enjoyment. The worship of their pantheon of gods is designed to attain this end." End quote. Similarly, the region of the Hopi, another important Pueblo Indian tribe, is concerned with the getting of food and of other material blessings. Some other of the Pueblo Indians have less complex ceremonials. The Pima, a, quote, powerful sedentary tribe, reduced to distress and decadence, are far less given than their Pueblo neighbours to the outward show of religion. They appear to have no other than occasional rain dance, the Neveteu, and other ceremonies for the cure of disease, so far as could be ascertained in a comparatively brief sojourn among them. Their religion comprised a belief in the supernatural or magic power of animals, and especially in the omnipotence of the sun. End quote. These people have a class of hereditary priests who are concerned with the cure of disease. They also have magicians who bring on rain and have power over the weather, crops, and so forth. They have no hereditary class with the cult of deities. As for the doctors and the magicians are the rulers of the tribe. So in this case, as in others, the effect of a drop in the level of culture has been to cause the gods and their cults to disappear, and to leave only those elements of the former religious system that pertain to the practical benefit of the community. In the Pueblo area, the ritual is mainly concerned with food. It would be thought that this might be due to the natural desire of the people to protect their food supply and to appeal to their gods to get it for them. This suggestion, which is so often made, assumes the existence among the bulk of the people of a lively sense of their gods, which cannot be conceded, for it assumes that the knowledge of the gods is really a common possession of the peoples, not simply part of the priestcraft, as is in so many other places. It must be remembered constantly that the civilization of the Pueblo area is founded upon the cultivation of maize, which cereal comes from Mexico. Moreover, Mexican and Mayan ritual centered around agriculture, that is, on maize growing. This ritual, as Fuchs has asserted, is similar to that of the Pueblo Indians, who consequently must have got it, together with their maize, from the Mexicans or Maya. Their traditions assert that their ceremonial was taught them. The Hopi, for example, say that the sun cult was introduced from the south by one of their clans. With this sun cult go certain ceremonies, among them that of the calling back of the sun. The object of this winter solstice ceremony is not only to draw back the sun, the arrival of whom is dramatized, but likely to impart new life to all nature, to fertilize the earth, that the germ god may vitalize not only the crops, the seeds of which are now piled below the altar, but also the game, domestic animals, human beings, material resources of all kinds. End quote. Other Hopi stories recount the arrival of clans with certain rites, and the whole of their traditions support the view of an alien origin of their ceremonial, agricultural, and otherwise. In this, they are typical of the Pueblo tribes as a whole. Among the tribes of the Mound area and those that migrated thence into the plains, the relationship is clear between the ruling classes and cult of gods. The chief's son, the ruler of Natchez of Louisiana, acted as high priest in certain agricultural ceremonies. He brought on rain and acted as an incarnate deity. The Yuchi of the Savannah River, who claim to be children of the sun, have a number of ceremonies taught them by their culture hero, probably a son of the sun. The Cherokee say that the knowledge of cults died out with their hereditary priesthood. Consequently, the following is a description of the Cherokee's attitude towards religion. Quote, "All his prayers were for temporal and tangible blessings, for health, for long life, for success in the chase, in fishing, in war, in love, for good crops, for protection, and for revenge. He had no great spirit, no happy hunting ground, no heaven, no hell, and consequently death had for him no terrors, and he awaited the inevitable end with no anxiety as to the future. He was careful not to violate the rights of his tribesmen or to do injury to his feelings." End quote. The relationship between hereditary groups and definite rights is evident in the case of the Omaha, the Sioux tribe of the plains. Their relatives of the East had an absolute monarch. Elf, just jump up. Just jump up. Jump. There you go. Sorry, dog's being a wally. And now I've lost my place. The relationship between hereditary groups and definite rights is evident in the case of the Omaha, the Sioux tribe of the plains. Their relatives of the East had an absolute monarch. A high priest was the only person who could make sacrifices to a supreme being, who, however, paid little attention to them. The Omaha tribe is divided into two groups of 5 gentes. When the tribe is camping out, two groups of 5 gents. When the tribe is camping out, one group occupies the northern half of the camping circle, while the other 5 gents occupy the southern half of the circle. These gents were the possessors of certain ceremonies that only they could perform. They constituted, as it were, the hereditary priesthoods. The 5 gents of the northern half of the circle were the custodians of the rights that pertained to the creation of the stars and the manifestation of the cosmic forces that pertain to life. Nearly all of these rights have become obsolete, except those of the last named class. These constituted the ritual by which the child was introduced to the cosmos, the ceremony through which the child was inducted into its place and duty in the tribe, and the ritual required when the two sacred tribal pipes were filled for use on solemn tribal occasions. Miss Fletcher, who with Francis de Flèche himself, an Omaha, had studied this tribe so thoroughly, says, quote, "In view of what has been discerned of the practical character of the Omaha, it is interesting to note that only those rights directly concerned with the maintenance of the tribal organization and government were kept alive and vital, while those other rights, kindred but not so closely connected with the tribal organization, were suffered to fall into neglect." End quote. The rights that have survived are, in addition to those already mentioned, those pertaining to the sacred tent of war and the first thunder of the spring, and those connected with the food supply, which were connected with the 2 sacred tents. One of these tents contained the sacred white buffalo hide, the keeper of which conducted the rites connected with the planting of maize and the hunting of the buffalo. In the other sacred tent was kept the sacred pole, the keepers of which were associated with the maintenance of the authority of the chiefs of the tribe. In short, protection from without, and the obtaining of food and clothing were the objects of these rites that have survived. The Omaha, it is said, have no gods or goddesses, no tribal priesthood. Also, many rites pertaining to the sky have been lost. What is the cause of this loss? It is significant that they formerly had a class of hereditary chiefs, for nowadays they only have elected chiefs. Possibly, therefore, the loss of the ruling class involved that of rights pertaining to the gods, as well as of the gods themselves. This would account for the vague and obscure nature of the Omaha ideas. The Sioux, in their ancestral home, had rulers, and the high priests and deities. So evidently, the culture of the Omaha is but a wreck of its former self, and only comparison with the religious systems of the other Siouan tribes will make possible its reconstruction. The Omaha are in two groups, of which that concerned with the rights pertaining to the sky itself, of which that concerned with the rights pertaining to the sky is itself connected with the sky. According to the tribal myths, human beings were the result of the union between the sky people and the earth people. Since the sky people were connected with the rites pertaining to the sky, it seems probable that the tribe once had cults of gods along with their hereditary chiefs. The Dakota branch of the Sioux have cults associated with the sun god, which are carried out by the high priest. The evidence in North America, as in Oceania, shows that cults of gods are the affair of their descendants. When the people connected with the sky disappear, so do the gods and their cults. This appears clearly in the case of the Omaha, where the loss of the right is ascribed by the people themselves to the dying out of those family groups in which they were hereditary possessions. But when the groups with their ancestor cult have gone, something is usually left that harks back to the archaic civilization. Some rites are retained that deal with practical ends. This is evident in the Pueblo region, where the people ascribe all their civilization to the twin children of the sun, who led them out of the underworld. These beings had not founded a ruling class, claiming descent from them. So a direct cult of the sun, as is found in Egypt, does not exist. The cults of these peoples are centered mainly around their agriculture, which is the chief preoccupation of their lives. Certain fraternities among them deal with healing, but the most important deal with the food supply. In this, they are acting similarly to the peoples of Indonesia and Melanesia. It is probable, therefore, that the archaic civilization was, in all parts of the region, in possession of a theory of agriculture and of disease that required ceremonies to procure good health and an abundant food supply. Since these people probably brought agriculture with them to all parts of the region, it would not be expected that they would teach their subject. It would be expected that they would teach their subjects not only the practical methods of cultivation, but also the theoretical considerations underlying the process of getting food, which necessitated the institution of a priesthood. This would make the performance of a ceremonial a matter of practical necessity. And the natives, even when the people of the archaic civilization had departed, would tend for that reason to maintain such ceremonial. It stands to reason that this ceremonial was based upon false analogy and was obviously absurd. But the prestige of the people of the archaic civilization and the claim of their rulers to divinity would serve to endow their statements with a glamour that would not fail to impress itself upon the natives. And once such ideas had become part of the social heritage, they would not readily be lost. On the other hand, the lost cults of sky deities show that the children of the sun and the commoners were possessed of entirely different social traditions. Both were living in the same communities, but their antecedents were utterly dissimilar. The original children of the sun carried about with them beliefs concerned with the sky world. They maintained a cult connected with their relatives in the sky, and this cult disappeared with them. After they had gone, the connection with the sky was only maintained for practical ends. Moreover, these skyborn folk differed from the rest of the community, and that they went after death to the sky, while the others went underground or elsewhere. It therefore would seem that communities ruled over by the children of the sun consisted of two entirely distinct parts that had no real connection with one another, either during life or after death. The explanation of this deeply rooted distinction will, it is evident, go far to solve the problem of the origin of the archaic civilization. It must be borne in mind at the same time that the children of the sun, although they bulk large in the story of the archaic civilization, do not necessarily constitute the whole of the ruling class. It has been found in India that some of the Asura ruling families were closely connected with the underworld, the place so often frequented by the commoners of various places from Egypt to America. Moreover, in Polynesia, the later ruling class was closely connected with the underworld, and it has been claimed that this ruling class has been derived from the archaic civilization. So it must be realized that the archaic civilization may have possessed a complex ruling group, formed of two or more distinct elements, of which the children of the sun constituted only one. It is with this group of children of the sun that the sky world is associated. The ruling group of the archaic civilization can at the same time be distinguished as a whole from the commoners. Throughout the region it is associated with the custom of mummification, which is practically never practiced in the case of commoners. Elliot Smith, in his Migrations of Early Culture, has shown that mummification is practiced throughout the region. Although he does not stress the point, it is evident from his exposition of facts that this custom is reserved for members of the ruling class. For the commoners, internment is the usual fate. Anyone who wishes to study the matter in detail is referred to Elliot Smith's monograph. I shall content myself here with filling up one or two small gaps in the evidence and with stressing the relationship of the custom to rulers. It is unnecessary to insist on the practice of mummification by the ancient Egyptians. On the other hand, it was sporadic in Babylonia, which is another token of the cultural difference between the two civilizations. It has already been said that Dravidian India shows traces more or less definite of Babylonian influence, but the nature and extent of this influence cannot as yet be estimated. At the same time, certain peoples of Dravidian India show strong traces of relationship with the archaic civilization, and that they still erect dolmens. The problem of the origins of Indian civilization is therefore complex. Although cremation is now so widespread, it is noteworthy that Indian tradition speaks of mummification. Dr. Crook mentions, quote, "The belief in the possibility of securing the body from decay is in the Deccan tales of the Chandan Raja and Sodewabai," end quote. In the Vishnu Purana, it is said that the body of Nimi, the son of Ikshwaku, the son of Vaivat, Vaivatswata, the son of the sun, and therefore of the solar line, was preserved from decay by, quote, being embalmed with fragrant oils and resins, and it remained as entire as if it was mortal, as if it were immortal, end quote. Thus the practice was certainly known among the children of the sun. Dr. Crook says that in the Mahabharata, the body of King Pandu, the father of the Pandava princess, was smeared with sandalwood paste. The Brahmins also knew of it, for Wilson, in his translation of the Vishnu Purana, comments on the case of Nimi, saying that a certain Brahmin mummified his mother's body. Quote, for this purpose, he first washes it with the 5 excretions of a cow, and the 5 pure fluids or milk, curds, ghee, honey and sugar. He then embalms it. I leave out the native terms. Agalokum, camphor, musk, saffron, sandal, and a resin called kakola, and envelops it separately with flowered muslin, silk, coarse cotton, cloth dyed with madder, and Nepal blanketing. He then covers it with clay and puts the whole in a coffin of copper. These practices are not only unknown, but they would be thought impure in the present day. End quote. Aryans also seem to have disemboweled the dead and filled the cavity with clarified butter, but it is not said whether this holds of the rulers only or not. Not only is mummification mentioned in India and in the epics, but it was practiced lately in certain places. The Todas of the Nilgiris now cremate their dead, but their burial practices were formerly different. An old manuscript written in 1603 said that they, quote, burn the dead body, but it must be wrapped in a veil of pure silk, which they called todapata, worth 5 or 6 phanams. And if this is lacking, they must wait for it, though it be for a year. In the meantime, in order to preserve the body, they open it at the loins, take out the entrails, and cut off the occiput. Then they place it in an arbor and dry it in the smoke. End quote. A certain amount of mummification is still practiced in Assam and Upper Burma. The Khasi, who speak an Austronesian language and erect megalithic monuments, preserve the bodies of their chiefs in honey and after a time cremate them, which suggests that the practice of cremation has been superposed on that of mummification. It is probable that this has been very generally the case in India. The Naga tribes perform some process of desiccation. It is not said whether this applies to any section of the community. The Mao are mentioned as placing their dead in a bamboo coffin shaped like a house and just large enough to admit the body. This coffin is put in the outer compartment of the house and the body is smoked, the process lasting from 10 days to 2 months, after which the coffin is taken and placed on the platform outside the village. The Tamlu Naga also smoke the bodies of their dead and then place them in wooden coffins in the forks of the big trees. They exhibit signs of a class distinction. For, quote, in the case of men of distinction, the body is thoroughly cured. The head is wrenched off and placed in an earthen pot. This body is then neatly thatched with tokapat and deposited at the feet of the tree in which the body containing the body is placed. The coffin containing the body is placed. End quote. Mummification is also practiced by the Chin tribe of Upper Burma, the Siyin and the Sokti branches being mentioned. The topic of the disposal of the dead in Indonesia is one that requires special treatment, and I do not intend here to discuss the modifications of mummification that can there be detected. It must be mentioned that mummification of rulers occurs in close connection with the archaic civilization. In Timor, the children of the sun were mummified. They were placed after death in open coffins in the branches of trees. Quote, and only when the flesh is decayed and the remains are reduced to a mummified condition are they buried facing the sun. the chief's father, Heer Kut, end quote, Heer Kut had later told me that mummification of priests is practiced by the Toraja of the Sadan district of central Celebes, a region closely connected with the archaic civilization. The Ingara of the Philippines, who ascribed their culture to beings from the sky, practice mummification. The custom is also reported in the Philippines among the Bicol, Visaya, Tinguinan, and Gadanes. Farther south, the practice occurs in Dutch New Guinea, at Marasi, and in Gilvink Bay, a region that shows strong signs of the influence of the archaic civilization, but my information does not state whether the practice is confined to the chiefly class, if one exists in such places. Working eastwards along the New Guinea coast brings us out into the Pacific, where the relationship between the preservation of the dead and the chiefly class has been fully established by rivers. He surveys both Melanesia and Polynesia and comes to the conclusion that, quote, the balance of evidence is in favour of the ascription of the practice of preservation to chiefs, end quote. Mummification is also practiced in Torres Straits, as well as in certain parts of British New Guinea, which, according to Mr. Chinnery, show strong signs of the influence of the archaic civilization. Chinnery speaks of the mountain tribes, whom he says that many of these mountain tribes have also elaborate practices in connection with the dead, of which he gives several examples. Elliot Smith has discussed at length the mummies of the Torres Straits and northern Australia, and has given as his considered opinion that they show signs of Egyptian technique of the 21st dynasty. That this practice of mummification was introduced to Torres Islanders by the culture heroes of the archaic civilization is made probable by the following remarks of Dr. Haddon. Quote, a culture hero, with masked performers and elaborate dances, spread from the mainland of New Guinea to the adjacent islands. Part of the movement seems to have been associated with a funeral ritual that emphasized a life after death. Most of the funeral ceremonies and many sacred songs admittedly came from the West. End quote. This evidence tends to ascribe mummification to the people of the archaic civilization. Evidence of the same nature is forthcoming from Samoa, where in Upolu, embalming, formerly practiced, is said to be due to people who came from the sky, and told people to bury them in a standing position with their heads uncovered. The Australian tribes of Queensland practice preservation of the dead. It is said, quote, desiccation is a form of disposal of the dead practiced only in the case of very distinguished men. After being disemboweled and dried by the fire, the corpse is tied up and carried about for months. End quote. So, if mummification can be practiced connected with the archaic civilization, its existence in Australia is further evident of the influence of this civilization in that continent. The distribution of mummification in the region from Egypt to America suggests its connection with the archaic civilization, and the evidence brought forward by Elliot Smith in this monograph is enough to convince most. But the new evidence in Indonesia that serves to fill up certain gaps makes his case still stronger, for it removes the possibility of objections founded on these former gaps. In America, mummification was evidently connected with the archaic civilization and with ruling families. For in Mexico and among the Indians of the Mound area, only rulers and nobles were mummified. The old cliff dwellers of the Pueblo region practiced mummification, but I do not know whether they reserved it for any social class. Throughout the region, mummification has tended to die out. The Plains Indians, for example, who once have lived in a region where the chiefs were mummified, have moved out thence and have lost the custom. Similarly, with the Pueblo Indians, in Oceania again, mummification tends to be a thing of the past. Only recently has its former practice in New Zealand been proved. It is obsolete in India. Right. Rah. That's the end of that chapter. Crikey. That was long. That took ages. That's 2 hours, nearly, to read that chapter. I'm just going to jump into the chat room and see who we've got listening. The next chapter, by the way, is chapter 14, Sky Gods as Life Givers. So that will be the next chapter that I shall read tomorrow. Red Eye Jedi, how you doing, buddy? And Raven, how you doing? Foreskin Vampire Slayer, how you doing? Good to see you. Caucasian Sasquatch, good to see you too. Just JP. Nigel Betts, Angel Wings, Dragonfly, Grand Rising Dragonfly, I hope you're still here. Jennifer Flores, one of my favourite people at the moment, how you doing? Christopher Harvey, TW, thank you very much, all you guys that are here listening. I can see we've got 12 people. 12 people. Hopefully you're enjoying this book as much as I am. I'm really enjoying it. It's a really good insight outside of official narratives into the migration of peoples, and and it flies in the face of official narratives. And he's basically, it's funny, but what he's describing, it's like, history is repeating itself right now. History is repeating itself. And we've got people taking advantage of other people's ignorance. We got classes of people that believe that they're entitled. They're entitled through hereditary lines. They are entitled to have more power and have more knowledge than the rest of us. And this distinction between a ruling elite and the common man. This idea that there's deities and sons and daughters, the children of the deities, how that all links into the Western world's Christian view. It's weird. It all kind of opens up and makes sense to me in my mind, but I can't really describe it or explain it to anybody. But I can it's like I feel like I can see what's been going on and what's going on now. And I guess it just makes me have to consider the fact that all I am meant to do in this life at the moment, all I'm meant to do and all I'm meant to be doing is witnessing what's going on. Witness what's going on with my own two eyes and use my own discernment. Yeah, but what are the robber barons at the end of the day, Red Eye? The robber barons really are they're the offspring of it's all about bloodlines, isn't it? It's all about bloodlines, man. It's always been about bloodlines, and it's always going to be about bloodlines. These people that believe that they are of a bloodline that just naturally entitles them to power and influence over everybody else, and that everybody has to live their life the way that these so-called elites want us to live it. And then straight away I just get reminded, this little thought in my head reminds me that this is all, it's all a fucking game. We haven't worked out the rules or anything to it yet, or the full description of the game. But each one of us, this life is a game. It's that there's a clear objective to win the game, but you're not competing against anybody but yourself. The idea is to work out, you know, the rules of the game are written on your heart, and we just have to navigate our way through this life knowing what we know. And there's nothing that we can do. We don't have the right to forcefully or forcibly wake anybody else up. The only right we have is to wake up ourselves. That's the only real right. The only rights over anything that we have are the rights over our own being, our own behaviour, what we take into our bodies and what we allow out of our bodies. And we can't, I've said a couple of times over the last couple of days, these people that we desperately want to wake up, I want them to wake up, they need to wake up. Look, wake up, smell the coffee, see what's going on, man. They're trying to pull the wool over your eyes, blah, 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 blah. Well, maybe it's just not their time. Maybe it was never, ever intended for them to wake up in this lifetime. We're all thinking that we've got to wake them up in this lifetime because, oh my God, it's all going to come to an end. It's not going to come to an end. It's just this particular cycle is going to come to an end. We're going to move into a new phase. We're going to move into a new cycle. And in that cycle, those people that haven't woken up this time round will get a chance to wake up that time round. But anyway, enough for me rambling on. Hopefully, it seems that the video has sorted itself out and that my streaming has gone all right today. It was a little bit grabbled at the beginning. It was a little bit grabbled at the beginning, but it seems to have gone quite nice and smooth. And we got 13 people for one of my book readings. That's the most number of people I've had at one of my book readings. Thank you very much for being here. Raven, thank you very much for being here. And Foreskin Vampire Slayer, thanks again. Seeing you again. It's good to see you again. And I'll be back tomorrow with chapter 14, Sky Gods as Life Givers. And I will also be back tonight in 1 hour and 40 minutes with Joe Gifford. I've got an interview. I don't like calling it interview. A chat. Me and Joe Gifford are going to have a chat. And it'll be a live stream, so there'll be a potential for a Q&A and everything at the end of it. But that's at 8 o'clock. If you check on my channel, 8 o'clock tonight. Wide Awake with Joe Gifford. So I hope to see you there. Thank you very much for being here. I'm going to go and sort some stuff out before this live stream. Don't forget, if you haven't done so already, please subscribe and like the video and share it with anybody that you think might be interested. Please, the inspiration to read this book came from Jason Brashear's Archaics. I know there's a lot of people who have got differing opinions about Archaics, and some of them aren't very good opinions, and so I'd just like to make it very crystal clear right now. I do not care. I do not care what anyone else's opinion is of Jason Brashears from Archaics, because I have made my own, come to my own conclusions over a long time of watching all of his work. Every single one of every single video that he's ever made, I have endeavoured to watch. I've got his website up on my browser, saved, on my browser, and been through all of his, been through his entire catalogue. And so I've reached my own, I've made my own mind up about Jason, and I don't care what anybody else has to say. I did watch I went and watched a channel that somebody yesterday recommended. I think it might have been Bizwoofer, but I went and watched one of his videos today, and I think whoever it was that recommended it said that it was kind of a parody channel and he was just having a laugh. But what I heard was not somebody just sitting there just having a laugh. What I saw and heard was two guys that just sat there and tore into another creator. And it seems that their entire channel, all they do is sit there and tear into other creators, and particularly into other YouTubers that make comments on those creators' channels. And personally, I don't appreciate that, and I took an instant dislike to this guy. But chalk outline, body chalk outline, or chalk body outline, or something. Took an instant dislike to him. All I saw there was somebody that was incredibly jealous, massively, incredibly jealous. He sat there criticizing other people who are probably doing better than he is. Jason's channel has exploded this year. In this year, he's got like 70,000 subscribers, and fair play to him. The guy's definitely done his research. He's read the books he said he's read, and yeah, it's true. We can't all read those books. We can't all read them because, they're too expensive, they're not in print anymore, etc., etc. But his quotations and the way he's catalogued his memories of information that he's taken from these books. Like he posted a thing yesterday, I think it was yesterday, saying somebody asked me for where I got my source, because he made a quote. The person looked up the book, found it on PDF, and the quote wasn't there. And so Jason got in touch with somebody that had the book, got them to find the book, open the book at the page, and there was the quote in the book. So Jason wasn't lying. He was actually directly quoting the book, but on the PDF, that quote can't be found. But it's in the book. So I think Jason has integrity, and I'm inclined to listen to what he's saying. And that does not mean that I'm going to take everything he says as gospel, or that, oh my God, Jason's got it absolutely right. But I do think that Jason is worth being listened to. It's worth listening to him. He's got some very, very, very useful information and observations that he's made that cannot be denied, and can only be denied by idiots that don't have the just don't have the inclination to go and research what he said. They just sit there going, yeah, all I can hear is just a lot of bullshit. Just all I'm hearing is bullshit, man. Just loads of bullshit. So have you actually gone and done any fucking research yourself, mate? If you think it's bullshit, you go and find the books that he's been quoting, and you go and prove that what he's saying is bullshit. All he's doing is quoting information from books written a long time ago. And if you haven't got the fucking balls to go and actually get this info, show us exactly why it's bullshit. Show us that he's wrong. Show us that he's fucking... You can't do it. Oh, mate, it really pissed me off when I saw these two laying into Jason. And I'm gonna have to have words with Christos as well, because Christos seems to be of a certain mind about Jason. He's obviously heard some things that have been said about Jason, and he's just rolling on with them. And I think he called him a grapist, as in, that he's done something that he shouldn't have done with a woman. Jason's Jason was the first person to sit there and say to everybody, "Listen, I was bad. I was a bad man when I was younger, and I made a series of bad decisions that ended me up in prison, and I continued. He ended up doing more time than he should have done because of his behaviour in prison, which was to protect his own person, basically. Caused him to get in fights and do things that got him constantly put into solitary. And in solitary, he was able to read the books. The thing is, and he said as well, he's done everything except kill a man. He's done every crime there is except to kill someone. He said that himself. So, you know, I'm a personal believer that men change. Men can change. Bad men can change into good men and can become good men. And if you don't think they can, then obviously you just have no... If you think that a leopard never changes its spots, well done for buying into the indoctrination poured into us when we were young. You know, basically. Exactly, Raven. It is so weak. The only content that they've got on their fucking page is sitting there laying into other people and what, doing it with the excuse of parody or satire. Is that they were not funny. What I watched, they weren't funny. They weren't being funny. They weren't. It wasn't parody. It was just two saddos sat there laying into a creator that works his fucking arse off. And he clearly does work his arse off, and he's reaping the rewards of that hard work and investing that into the production of what he's presenting to everybody. I personally respect that, because that's what I'd do. If I had people supporting, if I was in the same position as Jason, that's exactly what I'd be doing. I'd be investing in stuff to make the production better, to be able to give people even better quality production, so we don't have all these problems with buffering and shit cameras that don't work and, crappy microphones and all of that. And I don't like it, man. I've sat there and I've criticised creators, and I've done my own videos long ago saying, basically calling out creators for just being shills, money grabbers with no, like Isaac Cappy, But I learned very quickly that there was no value to that. Absolutely no value to anybody else whatsoever. Who gives a shit what my opinion is of a person? At the end of the day, I respect other people's. There are certain people whose opinions I respect, but when it comes to other people, I will always take that person on their own merits in the experience that I have of that person. And because I'm good at reading people. Anyway, bollock, I'm done. Enough. I'm going to end this stream. Thank you very much for being here. Actually, what I want to do quickly, if I can. 1 second. I need to find it. I'll play a video. There we go. It's done it again. Right, I got this problem. This bloody issue when I want to play videos and I load them up and they don't come up. They're not there. They're not. I can't see them. Ah, there we go. There we go. Right, I'm going to play you this video. This is on behalf of a friend of mine who has helped me out, and so I obviously want to help him out as well. This is my friend John. He has created a game for the mobile and PC, and it's been entered into best game for December 2022. So, with that in mind, a little while ago I did a promotion for two friends of mine, two fellow narrative deniers, my friend John Hyams and his friend and business partner Bart Sibrel. Some of you might know Bart from getting smacked in the face by Buzz Aldrin when he asked him to swear on the Bible that he'd landed on the moon.
You're the one who said you walked on the moon when you didn't. Calling the kettle black, if I ever thought of it. Saying I misrepresented myself.
Away from me.
You're a coward and a liar and a thief. And a thief.
Their game that they have developed together has just been nominated for Best Game of December 2022 with these guys.
Hey everyone, it's David with the GDWC. We've gathered all of your votes, all of your engagements for the last month so we can determine now the top 10 games for December. But wait, in case you don't know what I'm talking about, let me back up, let me explain. You can visit our website at thegdwc.com, where we've recently opened up all the games to the public so anyone can check out the thousands of games that have been submitted to us over the years. Under Games List, we have some recent highlights and an easy to search tool. And under Games Discovery, we have a head-to-head competition where you can vote for your preferred game. So we gathered all the votes from the head-to-head competition, page likes, views, shares, so we can determine the top 10 games of December.
Don't worry about these games. We don't care about these games. The only game we care about is this one.
Game of 7. You command your 7 angels to capture the gates of heaven in the 7x7 board game for mobile and PC. Game of 7 takes influences from chess, checkers, and backgammon to create a brand new 2-player experience.
So here, once again, for your approval, is the promotional video for Game of 7. Please go and download the game to your phone. Give it a try. It is a brilliant game. It's very engaging. And if you could you go and give them a vote and help them win this vote for December so they get the best game for December 2022? Because both Bart and John definitely deserve it as truthers and fellow deniers of bullshit narratives.
coward and a liar and a thief.
Right, I just want to say thank you very much to everybody that's been here, and I will see you in about an hour and a half.
Did you hear that Musk is bringing back everyone we hate? It's okay though, you can just block them all.
I remember when I lost my mind. Yeah. I remember when